The dust cloud rose high above the desert horizon as Jake Morrison rode his tired horse toward the small town of Red Mesa. His weathered face bore the scars of countless fights, and his eyes held the weary look of a man who had been running for too long. The sun beat down mercilessly on his broad shoulders, and sweat dripped from beneath his worn hat. Jake was an outlaw, but not by choice. 3 years ago, he had been framed for a bank robbery he never committed. The real thieves had planted evidence in his saddlebags while he slept at a campfire. When the sheriff found the stolen money, Jake's protests fell on deaf ears. He barely escaped the noose that night, and since then he had been a wanted man with a price on his head. As he approached Red Mesa, Jake noticed something strange. The usually bustling town seemed eerily quiet. No children played in the streets. No women hung laundry on the lines, and even the saloon appeared empty. The only sounds were the creaking of wooden signs in the wind and the distant barking of a lonely dog. Jake tied his horse to the hitching post outside the general store and stepped onto the wooden sidewalk. His spurs jingled softly with each step as he walked toward the town square. What he saw there made his blood run cold. In the center of the square stood a hastily built gallows. 2 young Apache women, barely out of their teens, stood on the platform with nooses around their necks. Their hands were bound behind their backs, and their dark eyes showed no fear, only defiance. Below them, a crowd of townspeople had gathered, their faces twisted with anger and hatred. Sheriff Tom Bradley stood near the gallows, holding a piece of paper in his hands. He was a tall, thin man with a cruel smile and cold blue eyes. Jake recognized him immediately. Bradley was one of the men who had framed him 3 years ago. "These Apache savages killed 3 of our men," Bradley shouted to the crowd. "They attacked our supply wagon and murdered innocent people. Justice demands they pay with their lives." Jake studied the 2 young women more carefully. Despite their situation, they held their heads high with dignity. The elder of the 2, who couldn't have been more than 20, had long black hair that flowed down her back. Her sister, perhaps 18, had the same proud bearing. Neither of them looked like cold-blooded killers. Something about this scene felt wrong to Jake. He had lived among Apache tribes during his years on the run, and he knew their ways. Apache women rarely participated in raids, and when they did, it was usually to defend their families, not to attack supply wagons for profit. Jake pushed through the crowd, keeping his hat pulled low to avoid recognition. He listened carefully to the conversations around him, trying to piece together what had really happened. "Found them with blood on their clothes," one man whispered to another. "Sheriff Bradley says they confessed," replied his companion. "About time we showed these Indians." "Who's boss around here?" added a third voice. Jake frowned. The story didn't add up. If these women had really killed 3 men, where were the bodies? Where was the evidence beyond bloody clothing, which could have come from anywhere? And why would 2 young Apache women confess to crimes that would certainly result in their deaths? As he moved closer to the gallows, Jake caught sight of a familiar face in the crowd. It was Marcus Webb, another member of the gang that had framed him. Webb was grinning widely as he watched the proceedings, clearly enjoying the spectacle. Now Jake was certain something sinister was happening. Bradley and Webb working together again meant trouble, and innocent people were about to die for their schemes. The sheriff raised his hand for silence. "These criminals have been tried and found guilty," he announced. "The sentence is death by hanging to be carried out immediately." Jake's mind raced. He couldn't let innocent people die, but he was outnumbered 50 to 1. If he revealed himself, he would be captured and hanged alongside the Apache women. But if he did nothing, 2 young lives would be lost forever. The executioner, a hooded man Jake didn't recognize, stepped forward and placed his hand on the lever that would spring the trap doors. The crowd fell silent, waiting for the final moment. Jake made his decision. He couldn't save everyone, but he wouldn't stand by and watch innocent people die. He slowly reached for his gun, calculating the distance to the gallows and planning his next move. Just as the executioner began to pull the lever, Jake noticed movement at the edge of town. A group of Apache warriors on horseback appeared on the ridge overlooking Red Mesa. Their leader, an older man with gray hair and ceremonial paint on his face, raised a war lance high in the air. The crowd gasped and turned to look at the ridge. Fear replaced bloodlust in their eyes as they realized they were outnumbered. The Apache warriors sat motionless on their horses, watching the scene below with silent intensity. Sheriff Bradley's face went pale. He had not expected this complication. "Get those savages out of here," he shouted to his deputies, but none of them moved. They knew they were outgunned. The Apache leader on the ridge let out a piercing war cry that echoed across the desert. It was clearly a warning: harm the women and face the consequences. Jake saw his opportunity. In the confusion and fear that gripped the crowd, he could act without being noticed. He stepped closer to the gallows, his hand steady on his gun. But before he could make his move, Sheriff Bradley did something unexpected. Instead of releasing the prisoners, he grabbed a rifle from one of his deputies and aimed it at the Apache warriors on the ridge. "You want your women back?" Bradley shouted. "Come and take them." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. One wrong move from anyone, and the streets of Red Mesa would run red with blood. Jake realized that this was about more than just a simple execution. This was the beginning of something much larger and more dangerous. The standoff continued for several tense minutes. Sheriff Bradley kept his rifle trained on the Apache warriors while the crowd of townspeople huddled together, unsure whether to run or fight. Jake remained hidden among them, watching and waiting for the right moment to act. The Apache leader on the ridge was clearly the father of the two young women. Jake could see the pain in the old warrior's eyes as he looked down at his daughters standing on the gallows. Despite his fierce appearance, he was trapped. Any aggressive move would result in his daughter's immediate death. Sheriff Bradley sensed his advantage and pressed it. "You have 1 hour to bring me 50 head of cattle and all the gold you have," he called out to the Apache. "If you don't, these two die and we'll hunt down the rest of your people." Jake's suspicions were confirmed. This wasn't about justice for murdered settlers, it was about extortion. Bradley was using the Apache women as hostages to steal from their tribe. The whole story about the attack on the supply wagon was likely a lie. As the Apache warriors reluctantly rode away to gather what Bradley demanded, Jake noticed Marcus Webb whispering something to the sheriff. Webb pointed toward the horizon where dust clouds indicated more riders, approaching from the east. Jake squinted against the sun and made out the shapes of about 20 armed men riding hard toward Red Mesa. They wore no uniforms, but they moved with military precision. These weren't ordinary cowboys or drifters. They were hired guns, mercenaries brought in specifically for this operation. The pieces of the puzzle began falling into place in Jake's mind. This wasn't a spontaneous act of frontier justice. It was a carefully planned scheme to rob the Apache tribe and possibly drive them from their lands entirely. The two young women were just the bait in a much larger trap. Jake moved closer to the gallows, using the nervous crowd as cover. He needed to hear more of what Bradley and Webb were planning. As he crept forward, he caught fragments of their conversation. "The cavalry will be here by sunset," Webb was saying. "Captain Morrison has his orders. Eliminate any Apache resistance and claim the land for the railroad company." Jake's blood ran cold. Captain Morrison was his own brother, a career soldier who had always followed orders without question, even when those orders were morally wrong. Jake hadn't seen his brother in 5 years, not since the day he had been forced to flee Red Mesa as a wanted man. "What about the women?" Bradley asked Webb. "Hang them as soon as the tribe delivers the payment," Webb replied coldly. "Dead hostages can't testify about what really happened here." Jake's hands clenched into fists. These men planned to take everything from the Apache: their cattle, their gold, their land, and their lives. The two young women on the gallows were just the beginning of a massacre. He looked up at the Apache sisters again. The older one had somehow worked one hand partially free from her bonds and was trying to loosen her sister's ropes. Even facing death, she was fighting to save her family. Their courage reminded Jake of why he had become an outlaw in the first place, not to hurt innocent people, but to fight against men like Bradley and Webb, who used their power to destroy others. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew everyone's attention back to the ridge. The Apache father had returned, leading several warriors who drove a small herd of cattle. Behind them came more warriors carrying leather bags that probably contained whatever gold and valuables the tribe possessed. "That's not 50 head, Bradley shouted. "I count maybe 30. The Apache leader raised his hand in a gesture of peace. "This is all we have," he called back in heavily accented English. "Please release my daughters. We have kept our part of the bargain." Bradley laughed cruelly. "A deal is a deal, old man. 50 cattle or your daughters die." He nodded to the executioner, who stepped forward and grabbed the lever again. Jake couldn't wait any longer. In one smooth motion, he drew his gun and fired a shot into the air. The loud crack echoed across the town square, causing everyone to jump and look around in confusion. "That's enough," Jake shouted, stepping out of the crowd with his gun drawn. "Let those women go." Several people in the crowd recognized him immediately. "It's Jake Morrison," someone yelled. "The outlaw." Sheriff Bradley's eyes widened with surprise and then narrowed with greed. "Well, well," he said, lowering his rifle slightly. "The famous Jake Morrison finally comes out of hiding. You know there's a $1,000 bounty on your head, don't you?" "I know what you did, Bradley," Jake replied, keeping his gun steady. "You framed me 3 years ago, and now you're framing these women. This whole story about an attack on a supply wagon is a lie." "Prove it," Bradley said with a smirk. "I don't have to prove anything," Jake shot back, "but I can tell you what really happened. Your men attacked the Apache camp, killed some of their people, and kidnapped these women. Then you made up the story about the supply wagon to justify hanging them." The crowd began to murmur uncertainly. Some of them had known Jake before he became an outlaw, and they remembered him as an honest man. Others were starting to question the sheriff's story. Marcus Webb stepped forward, his hand on his gun. "You're a wanted criminal, Morrison. Your word doesn't mean anything here." "Maybe not," Jake agreed, "but I'm willing to bet these people will listen when they see what's really going on." He pointed toward the eastern horizon, where the dust cloud from the approaching mercenaries was getting closer. "Those aren't more settlers coming to help. Those are hired guns, paid killers brought in to massacre the Apache and steal their land." Sheriff Bradley's face flushed red with anger. "You don't know what you're talking about, Morrison." "I know exactly what I'm talking about," Jake replied. "I know about the railroad company that wants this land. I know about the bribes you've been taking. And I know about the orders you gave to Captain Morrison." The mention of the cavalry captain's name caused another stir in the crowd. Several people looked toward the approaching dust cloud with new concern. "Even if what you say is true," Bradley said, "you're still outnumbered. Surrender now, and I might let you live long enough to see a trial." Jake smiled grimly. "I've got friends too, Sheriff." As if summoned by his words, the Apache warriors on the ridge let out another war cry. But this time Jake heard something else, the sound of more horses approaching from the west. He had sent word to some fellow outlaws before entering town, asking them to watch for trouble. It seemed they had arrived just in time. The situation was rapidly spiraling out of control, with armed groups converging on Red Mesa from 3 different directions. In the middle of it all, 2 innocent young women still stood on the gallows with nooses around their necks, waiting to see whether they would live or die. The sound of gunfire erupted from the eastern edge of town as Jake's outlaw friends engaged the approaching mercenaries. The peaceful afternoon in Red Mesa had suddenly become a war zone, with bullets flying and people screaming as they ran for cover. Jake used the chaos to his advantage. He sprinted toward the gallows, firing shots at the deputies who tried to stop him. His years as an outlaw had made him quick and deadly accurate with his gun. 2 deputies fell wounded before the others dove behind cover. Sheriff Bradley, realizing he was losing control of the situation, made a desperate decision. "Kill the hostages!" he shouted to the executioner. "Do it now." The hooded executioner reached for the lever, but Jake was faster. His bullet struck the man in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him tumbling off the platform. Jake leaped up onto the gallows just as Sheriff Bradley aimed his rifle at the older Apache woman. "Don't even think about it," Jake warned, pressing his gun against Bradley's temple. "You're making a big mistake, Morrison," Bradley hissed. "You can't fight the government. You can't fight progress." "Watch me," Jake replied, pulling the sheriff's rifle away from him. With Bradley temporarily neutralized, Jake quickly cut the ropes binding the 2 Apache women. The older sister immediately pulled the noose from around her neck and helped her younger sister do the same. "Can you understand me?" Jake asked them in English. The older woman nodded. "Yes, I speak your language," she said in clear, though accented English. "I am called Morningstar. This is my sister, Dancing Bird." "We need to get you out of here," Jake said, looking around at the growing battle. "This whole town is going to explode in a few minutes." Morningstar's dark eyes flashed with determination. "We will not run while our father and our people are in danger. These evil men have stolen from us and killed our family members. We demand justice." Jake was impressed by her courage, but he knew they needed to think practically. "Justice won't mean much if we're all dead. We need to—" His words were cut off by a new voice calling across the town square. Jake Morrison!" Jake turned to see a familiar figure riding into the chaos. His brother, Captain William Morrison, leading a column of cavalry soldiers. The captain's blue uniform was dusty from hard riding and his face was grim with determination. "Will," Jake called out, lowering his gun slightly. The brothers locked eyes across the battle-torn square. They hadn't seen each other in 5 years, not since Jake had been forced to flee as a wanted man. Captain Morrison dismounted and walked slowly toward the gallows, his hand resting on his saber. "I heard you were here," Captain Morrison said. "I came as soon as I could." Sheriff Bradley, seeing the cavalry arrive, tried to regain control. "Captain Morrison, thank God you're here. Arrest your brother immediately. He's interfering with legal proceedings and aiding hostile Indians." Captain Morrison looked at the sheriff, then at the 2 Apache women, then back at his outlaw brother. "What legal proceedings?" "I see 2 young women who were about to be hanged without a proper trial." "They're murderers," Bradley insisted. "They killed 3 of our men." "Where are the bodies?" Captain Morrison asked calmly. The question hung in the air. Bradley opened and closed his mouth like a fish, unable to provide an answer. Marcus Webb tried to step in, but Captain Morrison silenced him with a look. "I've been investigating reports of illegal activities in this area." Captain Morrison continued. "It seems someone has been stealing cattle from the Apache reservation and selling them to railroad contractors. The same someone has been making false reports to the territorial government about Indian raids." Jake felt a surge of hope. His brother had always been an honest soldier, even when following bad orders. It seemed he had finally found evidence of the corruption that had plagued this region. "You can't prove anything," Bradley said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Actually, I can," Captain Morrison replied. He pulled a folded paper from his jacket. "I have sworn statements from 3 different witnesses who saw your men attacking the Apache camp 2 nights ago. They also saw you kidnap these women." The crowd gasped. Many of the townspeople had trusted Sheriff Bradley, believing his stories about protecting them from Indian raids. Now they were learning that their own sheriff had been the real threat all along. Morningstar stepped forward, her voice clear and strong. "This man speaks the truth. Sheriff Bradley and his men came to our camp like thieves in the night. They killed my uncle and 2 of our elders. They stole our horses and our food. When my sister and I tried to defend our people, they captured us and brought us here." "That's a lie," Marcus Webb shouted, but his protest sounded weak and desperate. Captain Morrison turned to face Webb. "Marcus Webb, you're under arrest for cattle theft, conspiracy, and accessory to murder. Sheriff Bradley, you're also under arrest for the same charges, plus kidnapping and attempted murder." Several of Captain Morrison's soldiers moved forward to apprehend the criminals, but Webb had other ideas. He drew his gun and fired at Captain Morrison, missing by inches. The bullet struck one of the Apache women's former bonds, snapping the rope. Jake reacted instantly, his outlaw reflexes saving his brother's life. His shot caught Webb in the chest, sending the corrupt deputy crashing to the ground. Sheriff Bradley tried to run, but Dancing Bird, the younger Apache sister, stuck out her foot and tripped him. He tumbled down the gallows steps and landed in a heap at the bottom. The battle around them was beginning to wind down as Jake's outlaw friends and the Apache warriors drove off the mercenaries. The hired guns had no stomach for a real fight against determined opponents who weren't helpless hostages. Captain Morrison looked at his brother with a mixture of pride and sadness. "Jake, you know I still have to arrest you. You're still a wanted man, regardless of what happened here today." Jake nodded slowly. He had expected this moment. "I know, Will, but first let's make sure these people get justice." Morningstar stepped between the 2 brothers. "Wait," she said firmly. "This man saved our lives. He risked everything to help us when no one else would. Surely that counts for something." "It counts for a lot," Captain Morrison agreed. "But the law is the law. What if the law was wrong to begin with?" Jake asked. "What if I was framed by the same men who just tried to murder these innocent women?" Captain Morrison was quiet for a long moment, thinking. Around them, the townspeople were beginning to emerge from their hiding places, surveying the damage from the brief but intense battle. Finally, the captain spoke. "Jake, if you can prove you were framed, I'll do everything in my power to clear your name. But until then, you're still a fugitive." Jake looked at Morningstar and Dancing Bird, then at the crowd of townspeople who were listening to every word. He had a choice to make: surrender to his brother and hope for justice, or run again and spend the rest of his life as an outlaw. But before he could decide, a new complication arose. From the north came the sound of more horses approaching at full gallop. A scout in cavalry uniform rode into the square, his horse lathered with sweat from hard riding. "Captain Morrison," the scout called out. "Urgent message from Colonel Henderson at Fort Apache." Captain Morrison took the message from the scout and quickly read it, his face growing pale as he absorbed the contents. The paper trembled slightly in his hands as he looked up at his brother Jake, then at the Apache women, and finally at the gathered crowd. "What is it, Will?" Jake asked, sensing something terrible in his brother's expression. "Colonel Henderson reports that a large war party has left the main Apache reservation," Captain Morrison said slowly. "They're heading this way with over 200 warriors. The colonel believes they're coming to rescue these two women and to attack Red Mesa in revenge for the reported murders." Morningstar's eyes widened with alarm. "My father sent word to our cousins on the reservation. He told them what happened to our family. They are coming to help us." "This changes everything," Captain Morrison said grimly. "If 200 Apache warriors attack this town, it will be a massacre. The women and children won't have a chance." Sheriff Bradley, who had been sitting on the ground nursing his bruises from his fall, suddenly perked up. "You see? I told you these savages were dangerous."
"We need to prepare for war."
"Shut up, Bradley," Jake snapped. "This mess is your fault to begin with." But Jake knew his brother was right about the danger. The approaching Apache war party wouldn't know that the situation in Red Mesa had changed. They would see white soldiers and townspeople and assume the worst. In their anger over the attacks on their families, they might not listen to explanations. Dancing Bird spoke up for the first time since being freed. Her voice was soft but clear. "My sister and I can ride out to meet them. We can tell them what really happened here. They will listen to us." "It's too dangerous," Jake protested. "You just escaped from a hanging. You shouldn't put yourselves at risk again." Morningstar shook her head. "Our people need to know the truth. If we don't stop them, many innocent people will die, both Apache and white." Captain Morrison studied the two sisters carefully. "Can you really control a war party that size? They'll be looking for blood after what was done to your family. Our cousin Chief Red Cloud leads them," Morningstar explained. "He is a wise man, but his heart burns with anger over the murders. If Dancing Bird and I can reach him before he attacks, we can make him understand that some of the white people here are innocent." Jake looked around at the townspeople who were starting to emerge from their hiding places. Many of them were families with young children who had nothing to do with Sheriff Bradley's schemes. They didn't deserve to die for the crimes of corrupt officials. "I'll go with you," Jake offered. "Red Cloud might be more willing to listen if he sees that at least one white man was willing to help you." "Absolutely not," Captain Morrison said firmly. "Jake, you're still a wanted fugitive. I can't let you ride out there." "Then what do you suggest, Will?" Jake asked. "Are you going to fight 200 Apache warriors with your 30 soldiers? Even if you win, how many innocent people will die?" Before Captain Morrison could answer, another complication arose. Marcus Webb, who everyone thought was dead or dying from Jake's bullet, suddenly sat up and pulled a hidden derringer from his boot. Blood stained his shirt, but his eyes burned with hatred and desperation. "If I'm going to die," Webb gasped, "I'm taking someone with me." He aimed the small gun at Morningstar, but Dancing Bird threw herself in front of her sister, just as Webb pulled the trigger. The young Apache woman cried out in pain as the bullet struck her shoulder, spinning her around and sending her crashing to the ground. Jake's gun barked again, and this time Marcus Webb fell back and didn't get up. But the damage was done. Dancing Bird lay bleeding on the wooden platform of the gallows, her sister kneeling beside her in panic. "Get the doctor," Captain Morrison shouted to one of his soldiers. Morningstar pressed her hands against her sister's wound, trying to stop the bleeding. "Dancing Bird, stay with me," she whispered in Apache, then switched to English. "You must stay strong." The young woman's eyes fluttered open. "Sister," she whispered weakly, "you must go to our cousins. Tell them we have found good white people. Tell them not all are like the evil sheriff." Jake knelt beside the wounded woman, his outlaw's tough exterior cracking as he saw her pain. "She's right, Morningstar. Someone needs to stop that war party, and you're the only one they'll listen to." "I cannot leave my sister," Morningstar said firmly. "Yes, you can," Dancing Bird whispered. "Our people need you." "I will. I will be fine with the medicine man here." Dr. Mitchell, Red Mesa's only physician, arrived at that moment with his medical bag. He was an elderly man who had seen many gunshot wounds over the years. After examining Dancing Bird quickly, he looked up with cautious optimism. "The bullet went through cleanly," he said. "No major organs were hit. She'll live if we can prevent infection and blood loss." Morningstar looked torn between her duty to her people and her love for her sister. Dancing Bird reached up with her good hand and touched her sister's face. "Go," Dancing Bird whispered. "Save our people from making a terrible mistake." Jake stood up, his mind made up. "I'm going with her, Will. You can arrest me when I get back, but right now preventing a war is more important than your duty as a soldier." Captain Morrison looked at his brother for a long moment. The sound of distant war drums could now be heard echoing across the desert, growing closer with each passing minute. Time was running out. Finally, the captain nodded slowly. "Go," he said quietly. "But Jake, be careful, and come back." Jake grabbed his brother's hand in a firm grip. "I will, I promise." Morningstar kissed her wounded sister's forehead and whispered something in Apache. Then she stood up, her face set with determination. "We must hurry. Red Cloud moves fast when his blood is hot." As Jake and Morningstar prepared to leave, the Apache father, who had been watching from the ridge, rode down into the town square. His weathered face showed both relief at seeing his daughters alive and worry about the approaching war party. "Father," Morningstar called to him in Apache, then switched to English so Jake could understand. "We must ride to meet Red Cloud. These people here," she gestured to Captain Morrison and some of the townspeople, "they are not our enemies. Some of them risked their lives to save us." The old Apache warrior looked at Jake with suspicious eyes. "This one is an outlaw. How do we know he can be trusted?" "Because," Morningstar said simply, "he stood alone against 50 armed men to save our lives. That is not something a dishonest man would do." Jake saddled his horse quickly while Morningstar spoke with her father in rapid Apache. He could see the war drums getting closer, and dust clouds on the northern horizon indicated that Red Cloud's war party was only an hour away from Red Mesa. As they rode out of town together, Jake couldn't help but think about how strange his life had become. 3 hours ago, he had been a lonely outlaw with no friends and no future. Now he was riding beside an Apache woman to prevent a war that could cost hundreds of lives. Behind them, Red Mesa held its breath and waited to see whether peace or war would come with the setting sun. Jake and Morningstar rode hard across the desert terrain, their horses kicking up clouds of dust as they raced to intercept the Apache war party. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red that matched the urgency of their mission. As they crested a ridge about 5 miles north of Red Mesa, they saw them. Over 200 Apache warriors spread across the valley below like a dark tide. They rode in perfect formation, their war paint gleaming in the fading light, their weapons ready for battle. At their head rode a magnificent figure on a black stallion, his war bonnet marking him as Chief Red Cloud. "We're almost out of time," Jake said, spurring his tired horse down the slope. Morningstar called out in Apache, her voice carrying across the desert air. The war party immediately halted, weapons raised, as the warriors recognized her voice but remained suspicious of the white man riding beside her. Chief Red Cloud himself rode forward to meet them, his face painted for war and his eyes burning with controlled fury. He was a man in his 40s, tall and powerfully built with scars that spoke of many battles. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of absolute command. "Morningstar," he said in Apache, then switched to English for Jake's benefit. "We thought you were dead. The messenger who escaped the attack on your camp said the white soldiers had captured you and your sister." "Uncle," Morningstar replied, using the respectful term for an elder cousin. "Dancing Bird and I are alive, but barely. The men who attacked our camp were not soldiers. They were thieves and murderers led by the sheriff of Red Mesa." Red Cloud's eyes narrowed as he looked at Jake. "And this white man, is he one of the thieves?" "No," Morningstar said firmly. "This man saved our lives. When the corrupt sheriff tried to hang us without a trial, this outlaw risked everything to free us. He fought alone against 50 armed men." Jake remained silent, letting Morningstar speak for him. He could feel the hostile stares of 200 warriors, any one of whom could put an arrow through his heart before he could blink. But he also sensed that Red Cloud was a man who valued honor and courage, regardless of skin color. Red Cloud studied Jake carefully. "What is your name, white man?" "Jake Morrison," Jake replied honestly. Morrison, Red Cloud repeated slowly. Are you related to the soldier captain in Red Mesa? He's my brother, Jake admitted. Several of the Apache warriors began to mutter angrily at this revelation, but Red Cloud raised his hand for silence. Your brother serves the government that has taken our lands and killed our people. Why should we trust you? Jake took a deep breath. Because my brother and I don't always agree on everything. 3 years ago, I was framed for a crime I didn't commit by the same men who attacked your family. I've been an outlaw ever since, fighting against corrupt officials like Sheriff Bradley. The sheriff is the one who organized the attack on our camp. Morningstar added. He and his men killed Uncle Soaring Eagle and 2 other elders. They stole our horses and cattle to sell to the railroad company. When my sister and I tried to defend our people, they captured us and planned to hang us to cover up their crimes. Red Cloud's expression grew even darker. Where is this sheriff now? Under arrest, Jake said. My brother, Captain Morrison, arrived just in time to stop the hanging. He had evidence that Bradley was corrupt. Evidence means nothing, Red Cloud said bitterly. White man's courts do not give justice to Apache people. They will find excuses to let the sheriff go free. Maybe, Jake admitted, but if you attack Red Mesa now, you'll be killing innocent people along with the guilty ones. There are women and children in that town who had nothing to do with what happened to your family. Red Cloud was quiet for a long moment, considering Jake's words. Around them, the Apache warriors waited for their chief's decision. The desert wind carried the sound of their horses snorting and pawing the ground, eager for battle. Our sacred laws demand blood for blood, Red Cloud finally said. 3 of our elders were murdered. The spirits of our ancestors cry out for vengeance. Morningstar spoke up again. Uncle, I understand your anger. My heart burns for revenge too, but this white outlaw has shown us that not all of our enemies are evil. If we kill innocent people, how are we different from the men who attacked our camp? Besides, Jake added, Sheriff Bradley isn't worth starting a war over. He's just a small, greedy man who let his love of money turn him into a killer. If you attack Red Mesa, the government will send the army against your entire people. Hundreds of Apache will die to avenge 3 corrupt white men. Red Cloud's lieutenant, a young warrior with fresh war paint, rode forward. Chief, this could be a trap. The white man could be lying to save his own people. If I was lying, Jake said calmly, would I have ridden out here alone to face 200 warriors? I could have stayed in town and taken my chances with the fighting. Red Cloud nodded slowly. That is true. A coward would not come here. But another warrior wasn't convinced. This outlaw admits he is a criminal. Why should we trust the word of a lawbreaker? Jake felt his temper rise slightly. Because sometimes the law is wrong, he said. Sometimes the real criminals are the ones wearing badges and sitting in government offices. I became an outlaw because I was framed by corrupt men like Sheriff Bradley. I've spent 3 years running from false charges. Morningstar looked at Jake with new understanding. That is why you helped us. You know what it feels like to be accused of crimes you didn't commit. Exactly, Jake said. I couldn't stand by and watch 2 innocent people die for something they didn't do. Red Cloud was silent for several minutes, weighing his options. The sun was almost completely down now, and stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Time was running out. Either the war party would turn back or they would attack Red Mesa under cover of darkness. Finally, the Apache chief spoke. Morningstar, you say your sister is alive? Yes, Uncle. She was wounded when one of the criminals tried to kill her, but the white medicine man says she will live. And the men who killed our elders? One is dead. I shot him myself, Jake said. The other is under arrest. Red Cloud looked back at his warriors, then at the lights beginning to appear in Red Mesa in the distance. We will not attack tonight, he announced, but we will not leave either. We will camp here and watch. If the corrupt sheriff is not punished properly, if he escapes or is freed by his friends, then we will take our own justice. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than immediate war. Jake felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. That's fair, he said. But, Red Cloud continued, fixing Jake with a stern look, you will stay with us tonight as our guest. If this is a trick, if soldiers come in the darkness to attack us, you will die first. Jake nodded. I understand. And I accept. Morningstar looked surprised. You don't have to do this. You could return to town now. No, Jake said firmly. I gave my word that Sheriff Bradley would face justice. I want to see it happen myself. Besides, he added with a slight smile, I've spent 3 years sleeping under the stars. One more night won't hurt." As the Apache warriors began to set up camp for the night, Jake found himself thinking about how much his life had changed in just one day. This morning, he had been a lonely outlaw with no friends and no future. Tonight, he was sitting around a campfire with Apache warriors, trusted enough to be treated as a guest rather than a prisoner. But the real test would come tomorrow, when they returned to Red Mesa to see whether white man's justice would finally be served. Dawn broke over the desert with a brilliant display of gold and purple across the eastern sky. Jake had slept little during the night, partly from sleeping on hard ground and partly from thinking about what the new day would bring. Around him, the Apache warriors were already stirring, preparing for what could be either a peaceful resolution or the beginning of a bloody war. Red Cloud approached Jake as he rolled up his bedroll. "Today we will see if your brother keeps his word about justice," the Apache chief said. "Are you ready to return to face whatever awaits us?" "I'm ready," Jake replied, though he wasn't entirely sure what they would find in Red Mesa. His brother was an honest man, but military justice could be complicated when it involved civilian crimes. The ride back to town was tense but hopeful. Morningstar rode beside Jake while Red Cloud and 50 of his best warriors followed behind. The rest of the war party remained camped on the ridge, ready to attack if needed, but willing to wait for a peaceful solution. As they approached Red Mesa, Jake could see that changes had taken place overnight. A proper military camp had been established on the outskirts of town, with sentries posted and a flag flying over Captain Morrison's command tent. More cavalry soldiers had arrived during the night, bringing the military presence to nearly 100 men. But more importantly, Jake could see a crowd gathered in the town square around what appeared to be a makeshift courtroom. Tables had been set up, and a man in a black suit, probably a territorial judge, sat behind one of them with official papers spread before him. Captain Morrison rode out to meet them as they approached the town limits. His face was serious but not hostile, which Jake took as a good sign. "Jake," Captain Morrison said with a nod to his brother, then turned to Red Cloud. "Chief, I'm glad you came. We've been preparing for a proper trial." Red Cloud's eyes narrowed. "What kind of trial?" "A territorial court-martial for Sheriff Bradley and his remaining deputies," Captain Morrison explained. "Judge Harrison arrived from the territorial capital this morning with full authority to try cases involving crimes against Indian peoples." Jake felt a surge of hope. His brother had obviously worked through the night to arrange proper legal proceedings. "What about the evidence?" "We found the stolen cattle hidden in a canyon about 10 miles east of town," Captain Morrison said. "We also found the bodies of the 3 Apache elders that Bradley claimed were his own men. The whole story about an attack on a supply wagon was fabricated." Morningstar's eyes flashed with both anger and satisfaction. "So our uncle and the others will receive proper burial?" "Yes," Captain Morrison assured her. "With full Apache ceremony if that's what your people wish." Red Cloud considered this information carefully. "And the corrupt sheriff? What will happen to him?" "He'll be tried for murder, theft, kidnapping, and conspiracy," Captain Morrison said. "If convicted, and the evidence is overwhelming, he'll face the death penalty. If—" Red Cloud's voice carried a dangerous edge. Captain Morrison held up his hand. "Chief, I understand your anger, but even corrupt men deserve a fair trial. That's what separates justice from revenge." Jake could see that his brother was walking a careful line, trying to satisfy both Apache demands for justice and military requirements for proper procedure. It was a delicate balance that could easily tip toward violence if handled wrong. "We want to witness this trial," Red Cloud declared. "We want to see this white man's justice for ourselves." "Of course," Captain Morrison agreed. In fact, the judge specifically requested that Apache witnesses be present. "Morningstar, your testimony will be crucial." As they rode into town, Jake noticed that the atmosphere had changed dramatically from the day before. Instead of the angry, bloodthirsty crowd that had gathered for the lynching, the townspeople now seemed subdued and ashamed. Many of them avoided eye contact as the Apache delegation passed. Dr. Mitchell emerged from his clinic and approached Morningstar. "Your sister is doing much better," he reported. "The wound is clean and she's asking for you." Morningstar's face lit up with relief. "May I see her?" "Of course. But the trial is about to begin." Judge Harrison, a stern-looking man with gray hair and steel-rimmed spectacles, called the proceedings to order. Sheriff Bradley sat at a table with a court-appointed lawyer, his hands shackled and his face pale with fear. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and he knew it. The trial proceeded quickly and efficiently. Witness after witness testified about Bradley's corrupt activities: the stolen cattle, the bribes from railroad companies, the false reports about Indian raids. Morningstar gave powerful testimony about the attack on the Apache camp and the murders of the three elders. But the most damaging evidence came from an unexpected source. The hooded executioner from the day before, whose shoulder Jake had wounded, turned out to be one of Bradley's own deputies. Facing charges himself, he had agreed to testify against his former boss in exchange for a lighter sentence. Sheriff Bradley ordered us to attack the Apache camp, the deputy confessed. He said we needed to create an excuse to seize their land for the railroad company. When the Apache women fought back, he decided to frame them for murder to cover up what we had done. Bradley's lawyer tried to mount a defense, but the evidence was too strong. The stolen cattle, the murdered elders, the false reports, everything pointed to a systematic campaign of corruption and violence. During a brief recess, Jake found himself standing with his brother outside the makeshift courtroom. "Will, I want to thank you for doing this right. You could have just turned Bradley over to a military tribunal and been done with it." Captain Morrison shook his head. "Jake, what Bradley did was more than just corruption. It was an act that could have started a war. The Apache people deserve to see justice done properly." "What about me?" Jake asked quietly. "I'm still a wanted man." His brother was quiet for a moment. "Jake, I've been doing some investigating of my own. I think I can prove that you were framed 3 years ago by the same gang that Bradley was working with. Marcus Webb kept detailed records of all their schemes, including the bank robbery that you were blamed for." Jake felt a weight lifting from his shoulders that he had carried for 3 long years. "You mean I might actually be free?" "More than that," Captain Morrison said with a slight smile. "The territorial governor is so impressed by how you prevented a war yesterday that he's prepared to offer you a full pardon and a job as a deputy U.S. Marshal. It seems the territory needs honest men who understand both sides of conflicts like this." Before Jake could respond, Judge Harrison called the court back to order for the verdict. The jury, composed of townspeople, soldiers, and Apache elders, had reached their decision. "Sheriff Thomas Bradley," Judge Harrison announced, "you have been found guilty on all charges. The sentence is death by hanging to be carried out immediately." The crowd was silent as Bradley was led away. There was no cheering, no celebration, just the grim satisfaction of seeing justice finally served. Red Cloud stood and addressed the judge. "This Apache Nation accepts the judgment of this court. The blood debt for our murdered elders has been paid with proper justice, not revenge." As the sun set over Red Mesa that evening, Jake stood with Morningstar and Dancing Bird outside Dr. Mitchell's clinic. The younger sister was weak but recovering well, and both women were preparing to return to their people. "What will you do now?" Morningstar asked Jake. Jake looked at the deputy marshal's badge that his brother had given him just an hour earlier. "I think I'm going to try being on the right side of the law for a change. Maybe I can help prevent situations like this from happening again." Dancing Bird smiled weakly from her chair. "You saved our lives and stopped a war. You would make a good lawman." As the Apache delegation prepared to leave Red Mesa, Chief Red Cloud approached Jake one final time. "Outlaw who became a peacemaker," he said, "you will always be welcome in Apache lands. You have shown us that some white men can be trusted." Jake watched as the Apache riders disappeared into the desert darkness, taking with them the 3 elders' bodies for proper burial. The crisis was over. Justice had been served. And for the first time in 3 years, Jake Morrison could sleep without worrying about bounty hunters. Red Mesa would rebuild and recover from the corruption that had nearly destroyed it. The railroad would still come, but now it would have to pay fair prices for the land instead of stealing it through murder and deception. And somewhere in the territorial capital, other corrupt officials would think twice before trying to cheat the Apache people, knowing that there were honest lawmen like Jake Morrison watching over the frontier. The wandering outlaw had found his home at last, not as a criminal running from justice, but as a man dedicated to ensuring that justice was available to everyone, regardless of the color of their skin or the language they spoke.